20,000 human beings, impaled, alive, their screams echoing across the battlefield like a symphony from hell itself. When Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the most feared military commander in the world, saw this forest of dying humanity, he turned his massive army around and retreated. Not because he faced superior numbers, not because he lacked weapons or strategy, but because he had encountered something far more terrifying than any army, a man who had weaponized human suffering itself. This man was Vlad III of Wallachia. History knows him as Vlad the Impaler. But the stories you've heard barely scratch the surface of the systematic horror he unleashed upon the world. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval cruelty. This isn't just the story of a cruel king, it's the blueprint for how a human being can transform into something far worse than the monsters of our darkest nightmares. The real Vlad Dracula makes every horror movie seem like a children's bedtime story, and the most terrifying part. Every single detail is documented historical fact. Modern forensic psychologists who have studied Vlad's documented methods estimate that he personally ordered the torture and execution of over 100,000 people during his 6-year reign. To put that in perspective, that's more people than live in most major cities today. But numbers alone cannot capture the calculated creativity of his cruelty or the psychological precision with which he engineered human suffering. Vlad didn't just kill his enemies, he transformed murder into performance art, execution into psychological warfare, and torture into a science that modern researchers are still trying to fully understand. The year was 1431, when Vlad III was born into a world that would shape him into history's most innovative architect of agony. His father, Vlad II, ruled the small principality of Wallachia, caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Hungary. This wasn't just a difficult political position, it was a death sentence that had been passed down through generations of Wallachian rulers. Every prince who took the throne knew that survival meant choosing between impossible alliances, and that showing weakness for even a moment would result in invasion, conquest, and the systematic destruction of their people. When Vlad was just 11 years old, his father made a decision that would create the monster the world would come to fear. As part of a political alliance with the Ottoman Empire, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were sent to the Ottoman court as hostages, a common practice to ensure the loyalty of vassal states. But this wasn't merely political insurance. It was a masterclass in systematic cruelty that would teach young Vlad lessons he would later apply with devastating effectiveness. In the Ottoman court, Vlad witnessed firsthand how an empire maintained control over millions of people through the strategic application of terror. He watched as the Sultan's executioners performed their craft with clinical precision, learned how public displays of extreme punishment could break the will of entire populations, and observed how the threat of unspeakable torture could be more effective than actual violence. The Ottomans had perfected the art of ruling through fear, and Vlad proved to be their most attentive student. But the real education in cruelty came when Vlad's father was assassinated by Wallachian nobles, and his elder brother, Mircea, was captured by Hungarian forces. What happened to Mircea would haunt Vlad for the rest of his life and fuel the systematic revenge that would define his reign. Mircea wasn't simply executed, he was tortured with methodical creativity. His captors first blinded him with red-hot pokers, then flayed strips of skin from his body while he was still alive. Finally, they buried him alive in a specially constructed pit, forcing him to slowly suffocate while dirt was shoveled onto his conscious, screaming form. When reports of his brother's death reached the Ottoman court, witnesses noted that something fundamental changed in young Vlad's demeanor. The calculated cruelty he had observed in the Sultan's methods merged with a personal rage that would drive him to surpass his teachers in systematic brutality. He began to see torture not just as a tool of political control, but as an art form that could be perfected, refined, and elevated to levels that would shock even the most hardened observers. In 1456, at the age of 25, Vlad finally claimed the throne of Wallachia. But this wasn't a celebration. It was the beginning of a reign of terror, so systematic and brutal that it would make him the most feared man in Europe. His first act as ruler reveals the calculated nature of his cruelty and his understanding of how spectacular violence could serve multiple political purposes simultaneously. Vlad invited all the noble families of Wallachia to an Easter feast, ostensibly as a gesture of reconciliation after years of civil war. These were the same aristocrats who had murdered his father, the same families who had spent decades playing political games that weakened Wallachia and made it vulnerable to foreign conquest. They arrived at the feast dressed in their finest clothes, bringing their wives and children, expecting a celebration that would mark the beginning of a new era of cooperation and stability. The feast proceeded normally for hours. Wine flowed freely, conversations turned jovial, and the nobles began to relax in the presence of their young ruler, who seemed genuinely interested in building bridges with the established power structure. Then, as the evening reached its climax, Vlad rose to address his guests, Lou. He spoke eloquently about forgiveness, about the need for unity in the face of foreign threats, and about his hopes for Wallachia's future. His words were so persuasive that many of the nobles began to believe they had genuinely misjudged their new prince. Then, at a predetermined signal, armed guards sealed every exit to the hall and began the systematic arrest of every person present. The elderly nobles were immediately dragged outside and impaled in the courtyard, while their families were forced to watch. But for the younger nobles and their families, Vlad had devised a punishment that would serve both as revenge and as practical benefit to his rule. They were forced to march to the ruins of Castle Dracula, where they would spend the remainder of their lives as slave labourers, rebuilding the fortress that would become the symbol of his power. Contemporary accounts describe the march to Castle Dracula as a form of torture in itself. Noble families who had lived lives of luxury were driven through mountain passes in their feast clothing, forced to work without rest or adequate food until they collapsed from exhaustion. Those who fell were impaled immediately as an example to the others. Those who survived the initial construction became permanent prisoners, their noble titles transformed into cruel jokes as they performed the most degrading manual labour under constant threat of execution. This single event eliminated an entire generation of Wallachian aristocracy and demonstrated to both domestic and foreign observers that traditional political protections no longer existed under Vlad's rule. The message was unmistakable. Cooperation would be rewarded, but opposition would result in suffering beyond imagination. The story spread rapidly through diplomatic channels, reaching courts throughout Europe and establishing Vlad's reputation as a ruler who had moved beyond conventional political calculation into a realm of pure psychological warfare. But the Easter Feast massacre was merely the opening act of a reign that would redefine the boundaries of human cruelty. Vlad's signature method, impalement, wasn't simply an execution technique, but a carefully engineered system of prolonged suffering designed to maximize both physical agony and psychological impact on observers. Modern forensic experts who have studied historical accounts of Vlad's impalement methods describe them as surgically precise operations that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and pain physiology. The process began with the selection and preparation of stakes, which were deliberately fashioned to specific dimensions and bluntness. A sharp stake would pierce vital organs quickly and cause relatively rapid death, exactly the opposite of what Vlad intended. His stakes were carved to be just blunt enough to slowly separate tissues without immediately damaging organs, allowing victims to remain conscious and aware throughout most of the process. The diameter was calculated to cause maximum internal damage while preventing immediate blood loss that would lead to quick death from shock. The insertion of the stake required trained executioners who had mastered the anatomical knowledge necessary to thread the wooden shaft through the human body while avoiding major blood vessels and vital organs. The most common method involved penetration through the rectum, with the stake carefully guided through the body cavity to emerge from various points depending on the intended duration of suffering. Some stakes were positioned to exit through the chest, others through the mouth, and some through the shoulder or back. Each variation produced different types and intensities of pain, different timeframes for death, and different visual impacts on observers. The raising of the impaled victim was itself a form of torture, as gravity would slowly draw the body downward onto the stake, causing the wood to work its way deeper into the body cavity with each passing hour. Victims could remain conscious for 6 to 8 hours, sometimes longer, fully aware of their situation and able to call out warnings or pleas to anyone within earshot. The psychological impact of these prolonged death agonies created trauma that extended far beyond the immediate witnesses, as the screams could be heard across great distances, and the sight of the dying victims remained visible for days after the initial execution. Vlad elevated impalement from crude execution to psychological art by arranging his victims in geometric patterns that served as monuments to his power. Fields of impaled prisoners were organized in concentric circles, straight lines, or complex formations that could be seen from miles away. These human gardens served multiple purposes. They disposed of enemies, warned potential opponents, demonstrated the futility of resistance, and created lasting trauma in anyone who encountered them. Merchants traveling trade routes would come across these displays days after the executions, when decomposition had begun, but many victims were still alive, creating experiences so traumatic that survivors would carry the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The most documented display of Vlad's systematic cruelty occurred in 1462 during his conflict with the Ottoman Empire. When Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, assembled a massive army of over 200,000 soldiers to punish Vlad for his refusal to pay tribute, he expected to face conventional resistance. Instead, he encountered a form of psychological warfare that had never been seen before in European history. As the Ottoman forces advanced into Wallachia, they found that Vlad had transformed his entire principality into a weapon of psychological terror. Villages weren't simply burned or abandoned. They were repopulated with the impaled bodies of their former inhabitants, creating the illusion of normal settlements that revealed their true nature only upon close approach. Wells were poisoned not just with conventional toxins, but with the decomposing bodies of torture victims, ensuring that even water supplies carried visual reminders of Vlad's power. Food stores were replaced with carefully arranged displays of mutilated corpses. What appeared to be normal infrastructure from a distance turned out to be elaborate monuments to systematic cruelty. The climax of this psychological campaign came when the Ottoman army reached Targovist, Wallachia's capital city. There, outside the city walls, Vlad had created what Sultan Mehmed would later describe as the Forest of the Impaled, a carefully organized display of 20,000 Ottoman prisoners who had been captured during previous raids. The victims were arranged in precise geometric patterns that stretched for miles, with stakes of varying heights, creating a grotesque landscape of dying humanity that could be seen and heard from tremendous distances. Contemporary Ottoman chroniclers describe the psychological impact of this sight on the Sultan's army. These were battle-hardened soldiers who had witnessed the siege of Constantinople, participated in campaigns across 3 continents, and seen every form of warfare known to the medieval world. Yet when they encountered Vlad's Forest of the Impaled, many soldiers reportedly deserted rather than continue advancing through what they described as hell itself. The combination of sight, smell, and sound created sensory trauma that broke the morale of even the most experienced warriors. Sultan Mehmed II, who had personally ordered the execution of thousands during his campaigns and who was known throughout Europe for his own strategic cruelty, reportedly stood before the forest of impaled prisoners for several minutes in stunned silence. According to Ottoman records, he then made a decision that shocked his military commanders. He ordered the immediate retreat of his entire army. The man who had conquered the last remnant of the Roman Empire, who had never retreated from any battlefield, withdrew from Wallachia, not because he lacked military superiority, but because he had encountered a form of warfare that transcended conventional military logic. The retreat of Mehmed II established Vlad's reputation throughout Europe and demonstrated the effectiveness of psychological warfare when applied with sufficient creativity and systematic brutality. Word spread rapidly through diplomatic channels that a small principality had successfully repelled the Ottoman Empire's greatest military force, not through superior numbers or defensive fortifications, but through the strategic application of terror that exceeded anything previously seen in European warfare. But impalement was only the most famous of Vlad's torture techniques. Historical documents detail his use of flaying, where victims were skinned alive with specially designed instruments that could remove flesh in precise strips, while preserving life long enough for the victim to witness their own systematic destruction. He employed graduated crushing devices that could break bones systematically, starting with fingers and toes and working inward toward major limbs and finally the torso, allowing victims to anticipate and experience each stage of their physical destruction while remaining conscious throughout the process. Vlad's use of boiling represented perhaps the most scientifically precise of his torture methods. Victims were suspended over cauldrons of oil or water that had been heated to specific temperatures, designed to cause maximum pain without immediate death. The temperature was carefully calibrated so that flesh would cook slowly, allowing victims to remain aware of their condition while experiencing pain that exceeded the normal limits of human endurance. The process could be prolonged for hours by raising and lowering victims into the liquid, creating cycles of agony that would break even the strongest psychological resistance. Contemporary accounts describe Vlad's personal involvement in these torture sessions with clinical detail that reveals the systematic nature of his cruelty. He didn't merely order executions and then withdraw. He personally supervised the positioning of stakes, adjusted the angle and depth of penetration, and made real-time modifications to ensure optimal suffering. Witnesses noted that he seemed to derive genuine intellectual satisfaction from perfecting his techniques, approaching torture with the same methodical attention to detail that a craftsman might apply to fine woodwork or metalworking. The psychological profile that emerges from historical accounts suggests that Vlad's cruelty combined strategic calculation with genuine pathological enjoyment of others' suffering. While many of his actions served clear political purposes, eliminating opposition, deterring enemies, consolidating power, the elaborate nature of his tortures and his personal involvement in their execution indicate motivations that transcended mere political necessity. Modern psychological analysis suggests that Vlad exhibited characteristics consistent with psychopathy, including a complete lack of empathy, grandiose self-regard, and the ability to derive pleasure from others' pain while maintaining superficial charm and political effectiveness. The international impact of Vlad's methods extended far beyond the borders of Wallachia, influencing diplomatic relationships throughout Eastern Europe and creating ripple effects that would persist for decades. Foreign ambassadors began approaching Wallachia with unprecedented caution, aware that diplomatic immunity might not protect them from a ruler who had demonstrated such creative disregard for established international law. Trade relationships shifted as merchants sought alternative routes that avoided Wallachian territory, and military alliances were reconsidered as potential allies weighed the benefits of association with Vlad against the diplomatic costs of being connected to his reputation. The most detailed foreign accounts of Vlad's methods come from German merchants and Saxon chroniclers, who are often spared execution specifically, so they could return to their home territories with detailed descriptions of what they had witnessed. A German merchant named Jacob Rem left particularly graphic accounts of arriving at Targov East to conduct trade negotiations, only to find the central marketplace transformed into what he described as an outdoor museum of human suffering. With hundreds of torture victims in various stages of death and decay, arranged in elaborate displays that served as both public warning and artistic expression of Vlad's power. Hungarian diplomatic records contain accounts of envoys who were forced to dine with Vlad while watching freshly impaled prisoners die outside the windows of the dining hall. These meals served as forms of psychological torture for the diplomats themselves, who were forced to conduct negotiations while witnessing systematic cruelty that exceeded anything in their previous experience. The Hungarian court began sending only volunteers on missions to Wallachia, acknowledging that diplomatic contact with Vlad carried risks that extended beyond normal occupational hazards of medieval diplomacy. Perhaps the most psychologically revealing incident in Vlad's reign occurred when he invited Ottoman ambassadors to his court under the pretense of diplomatic negotiations regarding tribute payments. When the ambassadors refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, claiming religious obligations, Vlad appeared to accept their explanation graciously. He told the diplomats that since their religious headwear was so important to them, he would ensure they never had to remove it again. The ambassadors likely interpreted this as respectful accommodation of their religious practices. Instead, Vlad ordered his guards to nail the turbans directly to the ambassadors' skulls using long iron spikes, permanently attaching the headwear to their heads through penetration of the skull bone. The ambassadors were then impaled while still wearing their spiked turbans, their deaths serving as Vlad's official response to Ottoman diplomatic demands. The bodies were displayed along the main road leading to Ottoman territory, positioned so that future diplomatic missions would encounter them before reaching the Wallachian court, sending an unmistakable message about the fate awaiting those who attempted to negotiate with Vlad from a position of assumed superiority. This incident marked the complete breakdown of diplomatic relationships between Wallachia and the Ottoman Empire, but it also demonstrated Vlad's sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and his ability to transform apparently respectful responses into spectacular acts of cruelty. The murder of ambassadors violated the most basic principles of international law and marked Vlad as an enemy of civilized diplomatic practice. But it also established his reputation as someone who operated beyond normal political calculation and who could not be controlled through conventional pressure. The systematic nature of Vlad's violence becomes even more apparent when examining his treatment of different social classes, ethnic groups, and categories of perceived enemies. Merchants who attempted to cheat or showed disrespect were subjected to punishments specifically designed to be remembered and reported throughout the trading networks of Eastern Europe. Religious minorities and ethnic groups perceived as disloyal faced collective punishments that were intended to ensure community-wide compliance through shared terror. Each category of victim received treatment calibrated to achieve specific political objectives while simultaneously satisfying Vlad's apparent psychological need to inflict maximum suffering. The economic impact of Vlad's methods was both substantial and strategically calculated. By eliminating corrupt merchants through spectacular public punishments, he temporarily reduced trade fraud and increased tax revenues flowing to the royal treasury. By terrorizing potential rebels into submission, he reduced the costs associated with maintaining large standing armies or building extensive defensive fortifications throughout his territory. The fear he generated functioned as an invisible military force that patrolled his borders and maintained internal order without requiring payment, supplies, or logistical support. However, the long-term consequences of Vlad's approach created problems that would ultimately contribute to his political downfall. While his methods were initially effective in consolidating power and deterring enemies, they also created a climate of paranoia that made normal governance nearly impossible. Government officials were too frightened to provide honest counsel about policy decisions. Potential allies remained unreliable due to fear of eventual betrayal, and the general population lived in constant anxiety about arbitrary punishment for perceived offences. The system that had granted Vlad absolute power also isolated him completely from accurate information about his realm's actual condition. The end of Vlad's reign came not through military defeat in conventional battle, but through political abandonment by allies who had concluded that his methods made him more liability than asset. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, who had previously supported Vlad as a useful buffer against Ottoman expansion, began receiving detailed reports from his own ambassadors describing atrocities that exceeded any conceivable military necessity. The Hungarian court realized that Vlad's reputation for systematic cruelty was beginning to reflect poorly on his Christian allies, making diplomatic relationships with other European powers increasingly difficult to maintain. In 1462, Vlad was captured by Hungarian forces and imprisoned for 12 years, not as punishment for war crimes, but as a political necessity. His continued freedom had become incompatible with Hungary's broader diplomatic objectives. and his methods had made him too politically toxic to remain as an active ally. The imprisonment was presented as protective custody rather than criminal punishment, but the message was unmistakable. Even Vlad's supporters could no longer tolerate his presence in regional politics. During his imprisonment, accounts of Vlad's cruelty continued to circulate throughout Europe, taking on increasingly legendary characteristics as they spread through oral tradition and early printed materials. German printing presses produced pamphlets describing his atrocities, often embellished for dramatic effect, but based on documented testimonies from surviving witnesses. These publications marked the beginning of Vlad's transformation from historical figure to cultural symbol, with the real man gradually disappearing behind a mythology of absolute evil that would eventually inspire Gothic literature centuries later. When Vlad briefly returned to power in 1476, his methods remained fundamentally unchanged, but their effectiveness had significantly diminished. The political landscape had adapted to his tactics, and his reputation, while still fearsome, no longer carried the paralyzing psychological impact it had once possessed. His death in battle later that year marked the end of an era in which a single individual's systematic commitment to cruelty had shaped the political development of an entire region of Europe. The legacy of Vlad the Impaler extends far beyond the medieval period, influencing literature, political theory, and modern understanding of how systematic cruelty can be employed as a tool of governance. His methods demonstrated that terror, when applied with sufficient creativity and consistency, could achieve significant short-term political objectives, but at the cost of long-term stability and moral legitimacy that would ultimately prove unsustainable. Modern dictatorships have studied Vlad's techniques, recognizing both their tactical effectiveness and their ultimate strategic limitations. The transformation of Vlad from historical figure to literary inspiration reflects humanity's complex relationship with absolute evil and our need to process extreme cruelty through fictional metaphors. Bram Stoker's Dracula drew inspiration from the historical Vlad, but transformed him into a supernatural monster, perhaps because the reality of his human cruelty was too psychologically disturbing to confront directly in realistic fiction. The vampire Dracula is frightening because he represents inhuman evil, but the historical Vlad remains terrifying precisely because he demonstrates the depths of systematic cruelty that humans can achieve when power is unchecked by moral constraints or practical limitations. Modern psychological analysis of Vlad's documented behavior reveals a complex interaction between strategic political calculation and genuine pathological sadism that continues to fascinate researchers studying the psychology of political violence. While many of his actions served identifiable political purposes, the elaborate and personal nature of his involvement in torture sessions suggests motivations that transcended mere governance and entered the realm of psychological pathology. His case has become a subject of ongoing study for researchers investigating how rational political actors can transform into agents of systematic cruelty under specific historical and psychological conditions. The historical documentation of Vlad's reign provides invaluable insight into the mechanisms by which societies can adapt to living under conditions of systematic terror, the psychological strategies that allow individuals to survive extreme trauma, and the long-term social consequences of governance based entirely on fear rather than consent or legitimacy. These records have proven valuable to modern researchers studying political oppression, trauma psychology, and the social dynamics of authoritarian control systems. Perhaps most significantly for contemporary understanding, Vlad's story illustrates the fundamental paradox of effective systematic cruelty. While his methods achieved their immediate political objectives, they also created the conditions that made their own continuation impossible. The fear that initially made him powerful eventually made him politically isolated. The reputation that protected him from external enemies also made him toxic to potential allies. And the methods that eliminated immediate opposition also destroyed the social institutions necessary for stable, long-term governance. His reign serves as a historical case study in the self-limiting nature of power based entirely on terror and the inevitable political consequences of abandoning moral constraints in pursuit of absolute control.